Thank you so much. Thank you for the music and the beautiful music and the great word of our cross that is the symbol of our season, really. It is the second Sunday in Lent, which is the time and season that we are preparing ourselves to go towards that cross. And we're preparing ourselves to go towards that symbol. And so we do things in this season to help us get prepared. We give things up. We take things on. We try to be better at following after Jesus. We sometimes will give up the things we love so that it prepares us. Like these days are hard because I don't have chocolate or cake. But it gets even harder as we get toward the cross. So it's a little foretaste of preparing ourselves for the difficult days of the Holy Week. The season of Lent is where we practice. We practice what it will be like when it gets really hard. In the Gospel of Mark, there is no such thing as the season of Lent. And in Jesus' day, there was no time like that. But he does spend time preparing his disciples for the cross. In the Gospel of Mark, he says 3 times that he's going to die. He says 3 times he's going to get rejected, he's going to suffer, and he's going to die. And today is the first time we hear it in the Gospel. And he tells his disciples, I'm going to go toward the cross. I'm heading toward that cross. I'm going to suffer. I'm going to be rejected. I'm going to die. And his disciples don't take it very well. His most trusted disciple, Peter pulls him aside and he's like, and rebukes Jesus. Can you imagine rebuking Jesus? Peter rebukes Jesus. He pulls him aside. He's like, don't say anything like this. Don't say that you're going to die and suffer and be rejected and be killed. Don't say this kind of thing. But Jesus pulls Peter back into the open. And he says to Peter in front of everyone, get behind me, Satan. Because you're thinking of human things. You are not thinking of divine things. You get behind me, he says. It's as if Jesus is trying to make a point to all of the disciples and the crowd, because then he says to all of them, if any of you really want to follow me, you got to pick up your own cross and follow me. You have to pick up your own cross, deny yourself, and follow me. If it's like he's telling his disciples, you're going to learn to suffer. And not only suffer, but experience what in their day was the worst thing you could imagine, which was a death upon a cross that was gruesome and public and humiliating. He says, you pick up your cross and follow me. It's as if he's saying, you be prepared to suffer if you're going to follow me. I often joke that when people ask me why I'm a United Methodist minister, why I work at a college as a chaplain, why I like to work with college students, or why I like to work with part of the church, I often joke and say, it was because I like to suffer. Methodist ministers in the room like, yes, amen. It's not really true, but sometimes it feels like that. You know, it just feels like it. Because there's so much hope in the world, and then you're like, oh, gosh, not again. You know, last week, I think it was last week, I went to see the musical Hadestown. A few of you have gone to see it. It is the story of the Greek tragedy of Eurydice and Orpheus. It is so sad. It is a Greek tragedy on purpose. It's a tragedy. But what got me was at the end of the story, when the tragedy happens, Hermes, the god of the messenger, the god of the messaged, he begins to tell the story again. And he says, I tell it again, we tell it again, hoping this time it will turn out differently. But you're listening to it and you know it's not going to. But there is hope. There is hope that it will turn out differently. I got a little tear in my eye when he said that, because it's kind of like living in the church, you hope that things will be different. You hope the world will be better. You hope the church will do the right thing. You hope the institutions you're part of will become better. You hope the political systems you're part of will be better. You hope for a better tomorrow, a better story, a better new world. But over and over again, the story turns out the same way. You get disappointed over again. So it kind of feels like you're meant to suffer. But I do want to say this. I don't believe that you have to suffer to be a Christian. I don't believe you have to be a martyr to follow Jesus. I don't believe you need trials and tribulations so that you learn some kind of lesson. I do not believe that suffering is necessary for you. I don't believe suffering is necessary. It is not that you're meant to suffer or be a martyr or being beaten down or let people run all over you so that you can have your faith increased. I do not believe it. We do not deserve it. We do not deserve to suffer. We do not deserve the pain and sorrow of this world. Nor do we need it to be a better disciple. I believe that. But when Jesus tells his disciples to pick up their cross and follow him, it sounds like the suffering is inevitable. I believe what Jesus is trying to say to his disciples, that suffering and trials and tribulations, although not necessary, are more than likely going to happen. They're just going to happen. The cross is not necessary, but it is inevitable. Because Jesus knew that his ministry was going to get him in trouble, good trouble. Jesus knew that his inclusion of outcasts and lepers were going to make people uncomfortable. Jesus knew that his inclusion of women as leaders in his movement would be controversial and make people angry. Jesus knew that eating with so-called sinners would make other people despise him, think less of him, especially the religious leaders would look down upon him. Jesus knew that his revolutionary message of the love of his gospel would cause a stir. He knew that his message of unconditional love and his message that centered around the poor and the needy and those who were meek and blessing those who were without and condemning those who were comfortable and with, that his message of nonviolent resistance that called out the religious pious for not doing enough would make those in power furious. He knew they'd come after him. He knew it. He knew that his ministry was countercultural to the world and that the world would not be able to handle it. He knew that when he was making the first last and the last first, that he was exalting the humble and humbling those who were exalted, that he would be in the sights of those who wanted to keep the status quo. Jesus' ministry was so radical that division, hardship, trials, and suffering was inevitable. It was going to happen. Civil rights leaders who preached Jesus' message of inclusion and love knew this was going to happen. They knew they would be threatened with violence over and over again. And Martin Luther King urged his leaders to continue to advocate for justice and equality and love in the face of it all. And Martin Luther King, he advocated not just for racial equality, he also advocated for the poor. He advocated for those who were abused. He advocated to end the Vietnam War. He advocated for peace. And he joined protests for sanitation workers and those who were working in poor conditions to get better pay. He expanded his mission beyond just racial equality, but equality and love for all people to create a beloved community here in this world. He believed it was possible. And even King's own friends were telling him to hold back, to lay off of all the stuff that he was going for. Just focus on one thing they were wanting him to do. But he said, no, this is the gospel. And King did not suffer just to suffer. He did not cause trouble just to cause trouble. His message of love, equality, and justice was grounded in the gospel truth that stirred up those who would rather him not speak out. And it caused those who were in power and in privilege to oppose him in all kinds of sectors. The cross is not necessary. But if you preach the gospel, it is inevitable. It is the very reason mainline denominations in the United States have split apart. Because the mainline denominations in the United States were becoming too powerful for those in power. I remember in the 2000s when I was younger, and the mainline denominations, particularly and the United Methodist Church, began to protest and began to boycott Taco Bell, of all places. People began to refuse to eat there, and mainline denominations were on the forefront of refusing to go because the field workers picking tomatoes in Florida were in inhumane conditions and without a living wage. It was such a movement that Taco Bell within the year came to the table and made changes, improving the conditions of the workers, giving them a pay increase, and making sure that they were cared for. Mainline churches actually made a difference in the world at one point. I mean, mainline churches, mainline denominations began to start colleges for women like Greensboro College, even when people around them were ridiculing them and saying women didn't deserve such an education. Mainline denominations sought labor laws and labor changes so that we have a 5-day work week, so that children did not work in factories, so that corporations and businesses paid fair wages. Mainline denominations organized rights for women. They fought against the end of slavery, even while others, religious brothers and sisters, began to stand up to uphold it. Mainline denominations actually had an influence in the society and our lives and our world. We actually made a difference. And so in the 70s and 80s, there rose an opposition to it all, so that the influence of mainline denominations would not have so much power. And so the status quo keepers picked two issues to split the church apart: abortion and homosexuality. And slowly, one mainline denomination after another began to divide, from Episcopalians to Presbyterians to Lutherans, and last year to Methodists. Began to be pulled apart and divided and weakened so that they no longer had the power and influence they used to have in our system. My friends, when you stand up for the gospel of Jesus, for liberation and justice for all people, when you begin to live into the call of Christ, divisions, confrontations, and oppositions will come. It is inevitable. This is what I think Jesus is trying to say to Peter and all those who follow him, that suffering, confrontation, resistance to ministry will happen. Jesus knew that his message would get him in trouble. He knew that the gospel might cause conflict. He knew that it might cause people to want to even kill him. The cross isn't necessary, but it is inevitable. So that's what makes me a little teary-eyed. Because these days I think the church and the followers of Jesus would rather avoid the cross altogether. We'd like to be averse to conflict or confrontation or make people upset. We're afraid to take stands, to move issues, to be bold in our ministries because we are afraid of enduring conflicts that we have already endured. We're afraid of more pain or hardship or division. So it's easier to be neutral, to not make waves, to keep the status quo. It's easier. But easier doesn't make it better. Because if we continually avoid the conflict that might arise, if we continually avoid the hardships that might come, if we continually avoid the cross that's in our path, we will continually to be an ineffective, irrelevant, isolated, status quo keepers. Jesus says if you want to save your life, you got to lose it. If you want to save your life, you have to lose it. But if you lose your life for the sake of the gospel, you will save it. What good is it, my friends, if you gain the whole world and you lose your soul in the process? I hope we have not lost our soul. I hope the church has not lost its influence. I hope we do not settle for easier roads. I hope we've not traded our radical gospel of inclusion for an ineffectual gospel of self-assured security. If you want to save your life, you have to lose it. So I hope we can be the church again. I hope beyond hope that we can tell our story differently this time. I hope that we can get it right this time. I hope that we can follow Jesus and not be afraid of the inevitable that might come. Maybe that's what the season of Lent's for, to get us ready for it. To practice living in the hard moments, to prepare our lives for the difficult days, to get us ready to pick up crosses and face them head on, knowing that the hardest days and the most difficult moments may come from living out the gospel. It is the gospel, after all. It's good news. It is good news. The cross is where you find the good news. Because that's the cross that Jesus has already bared. It's the cross that Jesus has already defeated. It's the cross that Jesus has already made a way through it. It is the good news. And all we have to do is follow him. Follow him into new life. Follow him into new life.